Eurostar has been part of the railway landscape since 1994, when the first train departed from London Waterloo. But in the 30 plus years since, Eurostar has been a monopoly provider. There have been plenty of calls for other operators to be allowed to compete, but nothing has happened until now. Last week marked a seismic shift. Virgin Trains have been given permission to compete with Eurostar from as early as 2030. We talk exclusively with Virgin Trains about what their plans are and what comes next, with Diccon Spain, who is leading the campaign to get Ebbsfleet and Ashford stations reopened for international services. And we talk with Jon Worth, an acknowledged expert on all things Channel Tunnel Rail and European rail. This is the definitive discussion that explains exactly what Virgin have won, and what happens next, and what the challenges are that lie ahead. Well, welcome back to Green Signals, Jon. It's great to have you here again. I have to say, the last time we had a conversation, it's probably the most commented on and most positive piece I think we've ever done with anybody. So there you go. High bar. Hey, look, now we know it's
Right.
it's Virgin. It's out there. Before we talk about Virgin, what about the ones that didn't succeed? You know, Gemini, Evelyn, Trenitalia, Eurostar themselves. I mean, any surprises there? Were you sort of shocked with the outcome?
I'm not shocked with the outcome because ultimately Virgin put together an amazingly coherent bid. It was very easy to follow, very easy to read. Looking through the documents submitted to the ORR, I think that Evelyn didn't succeed was obvious from the start. They were clearly the weakest of the bidders. The one that nags at me to some extent is what happened with Gemini, because I have some very interesting ideas about what to do and how to do channel tunnel traffic differently. And unfortunately, their chances of making any of those see the light of day are now rather difficult. They've said they're going to try and carry on, but we don't exactly know how that's going to work out. So ultimately, the big question that ORR posed about Gemini was, are they or were they solid enough financially to be able to deliver on what they promised? So maybe they were taking too many risks, could not reassure ORR that they could absolutely deliver. Although it must be said, I think they probably had the least risky of the rolling stock strategies, going for Siemens as Gemini wanted to order. The one that's, of course, perhaps most interesting is then why did Trenitalia ultimately not succeed? Because you can't say that Trenitalia don't have deep pockets. And reading between the lines of the ORR decision, it seems like it was a close run thing between Virgin and Trenitalia. It was just that little bit clearer and that little bit more obvious exactly how Virgin would deliver, and that's probably what the reason they won out over Trenitalia. So Evelyn, not a surprise. Gemini, I'm a little bit frustrated, and then a close run thing I would say between Virgin and Trenitalia.
Do you think, Gemini, just briefly on Gemini, because we saw their press statement that you've just referred to. They said that they're just going to have a pause and think, but they're still keen to be involved in some way. Do you think their Stratford International strategy backfired a bit in the end? Because that was presumably one of the areas where the ORR said it just didn't really understand how you were going to fund that.
Well, and also ultimately, ORR can't really make a judgment on that particular part. They had to make a judgment on the economic viability of that operator. Now, their decision was that much narrower. The decision was not, what's the best way of using all of this infrastructure we've got, serving as many passengers as possible, reducing the pressure on St. Pancras, all of which are valid questions, but ORR was not making a decision on that basis. So, so ultimately the cost, particularly how much it would cost to equip the terminal and their ideas of actually improving the size of the terminal and throughput of the terminal in Stratford, I think that was probably a risk too far. So ultimately, I'm left with this kind of slightly bitter taste in my mouth about all of this, that in the end, the way ORR took its decision was comparatively narrow, which was exactly what they were charged to do, which is fine. Yeah. But ultimately, if we want to answer the question more fundamentally, what type of services do we want to see through the Channel Tunnel in the medium term from London or theoretically other places in the UK? We didn't really have a full and complete answer to that, but then ORR was not really charged with answering that. It was about who has got the best case to use this depot.
To use a depot. It's a really good point, because actually in the ORR's press release, they say, don't they, it's not for us to decide where Virgin stop, right? We are just focused on the depot, and we'll come back to that, no doubt, in due course. Okay, well, look, Virgin have won it. But before we talk about Virgin, I have had the chance to have a short chat with Phil Whittingham, who led and is leading the Virgin bid for international services. And I spoke to him, and this is what he had to say. Have a listen to this, Jon. Well, I'm delighted to be joined on Green Signals by Phil Whittingham, who has led the bid for Virgin trains for the cross-channel services. Welcome, Phil. And I suppose first order of business is to say congratulations. You must be all really delighted.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Thanks for having us on. And yeah, I mean, obviously, naturally delighted. Everybody at Virgin is over the moon, and it's been 2.5 years in the making, and the team have done a really, really good job to get us to this place.
Well, yeah, fantastic. And I suppose big question is, what happens next? Because there's still a lot to do, isn't there? I mean, that was clear from the ORR's decision letter. What's the kind of critical next steps for you?
So, I mean, I think the immediate next step is to, we believe ORR are going to be issuing a directions letter, which we still haven't had yet. So we will need to wait and see what that directions letter says. But obviously then we'll need to, finalise the depot access agreement with Eurostar, and then that will unlock the funding and then place an order, hopefully by the end of the year. And then we will hopefully then get the framework agreements in place as well. So we've got quite a lot to do over the next sort of 3 to 6 months to make sure that we can realise this opportunity.
No, okay, absolutely. Now, so that was interesting. So the depot agreement obviously comes first. So until you've absolutely got all that nailed down, you don't do the rolling stock. That makes perfect sense. But so just in terms of Temple Mills, looking at the sort of various submissions that both you and Eurostar made to the ORR, I suppose the most diplomatic way of putting it is there's a difference of opinion on a number of matters. Are you confident that those can be ironed out commercially, or is there a possibility that the ORR might have to intervene again?
I mean, we're optimistic that Eurostar will come to the table and negotiate with us. We started discussions. They were paused when the Section 17 started. But yes, I mean, we hope that Eurostar can and will engage with us in a sort of meaningful way. But obviously, if we don't feel that that's the case, then obviously ORR is there to support us if we need to. But I mean, the ORR's run a very rigorous process. They've identified some available capacity, and we're delighted to have been awarded that capacity.
And do you need to spend a bit of capex at Temple Mills to accommodate what will be a different train to the ones that are currently maintained there?
I mean, we've anticipated spending some capex. We, as I sort of alluded to, we've not had a lot of engagement with Eurostar yet. When the Section 17 started, they paused discussions. So we need to re-engage with Eurostar to work out exactly what's needed. But obviously, the fact that they're buying 200-metre trains from the same family from Alstom is helpful. So that any depot modifications will obviously naturally be shared between us.
Right. So let's just talk very briefly about the rolling stock then. So the trains you've ordered, the Avilia Stream, I mean, how standard are they? Or do they need to be modified for your use going through the tunnel, or are they off the shelf?
They're predominantly off the shelf. I mean, there's a few modifications needed to make sure the 30-minute running is capable through the tunnel, whereas under normal TSIs it's 15 minutes. So there's a few small modifications to which can easily be accommodated. Alstom have identified what those are, and obviously with the Avilia Stream as well, they've got a good understanding. With the Horizon, they've got a good understanding of what's required to navigate the complexities of the tunnel.
I suppose one of those other technical standards is the fact that in Germany and Switzerland, they operate on a different frequency, don't they? It's 15 kilohertz, is it, compared to our 25 kilohertz? Will your trains come with that 15 kilohertz capability so that they could go to Germany and Switzerland in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of the things we're discussing with Alstom. We want the opportunity to expand, relatively quickly after we've got settled in. I've got aspirations to go, as you say, to Germany and to Switzerland. So, yeah, I mean, we're keen to make sure that the train that we buy is capable of doing that.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. Otherwise, that would be an expensive modification in the future.
Yeah.
Just one of the things that's been very, very vocal, I suppose, during this whole process are the views of stakeholders in Kent, who are very keen to see Ebbsfleet and Ashford in particular reopen to international traffic. And some bidders had made more of some aspirant operators, had made more of a thing of that than others. You've been, I think, quite cautious about Ebbsfleet and Ashford. What's the current position on those, Phil?
So what we've said all along is that if the stations were to open, we would stop at one or both of those stations. We have been clear, though, that, as you can imagine, there's a lot of equity and debt to raise in this process, and adding to that problem. So is not a day one thing that we wanted to do. So we believe that the stations will be loss making. If we were to stop there, we would have to take those on. So we're encouraging discussions between stakeholders to see how the stations could be opened without adding to the sort of costs that that we're going to pick up on day one.
No, I get that. And is that cost because there will be border security issues there, sort of post Brexit? There's a lot of cost there to get them compliant for the new rules, or is it the fact the market itself is such that they would be loss making?
There's going to be. We're not. Obviously, we're a bit unsighted on what the market is. We can see from stakeholders what their aspirations are, and what they believe the traffic has been in the past. But so we're cautious about just jumping in both feet, and we'd like to sort of understand what the market is. But obviously, there is obviously border controls, security controls that need to be re-established. We need to have commitments from PAF in France to make sure that borders can be put back in place.
Yeah.
So we're keen to make sure that we don't overcommit on day one and then run the risk of not achieving it. But it's definitely something that we've got in our plans to do in due course.
Okay. And I suppose final question then is about sort of future plans, if I may. Eurostar used to go to, the Disney resort. They used to have sort of ski trains down to the south of France. And I suppose there's real excitement with Virgin coming on board with this because, you do push the envelope. Initially, you've said Paris, Brussels and Amsterdam, which sounds pretty sensible, really, sort of establish a base. But it's that future stuff, isn't it? Are we going to be seeing Virgin pushing that envelope and going to exciting new destinations that have hitherto been unserved?
That's definitely the aspiration that we've got. Virgin companies want to sort of push the boundaries, as you know. So, we want to, go to these new markets. We don't want to take such a long time to open up some of these markets that has been the case, and we want to make sure that within the group we've already got significant contacts with, say, the likes of Disney and Air France. So we want to make sure that if those opportunities are there, that we maximise on them.
That sounds all exciting stuff. I know there's a huge amount to do. You just read the documentation that's in the public domain, and you can see how much there is to do. So we wish you all the very best with that. And well done once again. And thanks for coming on the show. Really do appreciate it. But for now, Phil, thanks so much.
Thank you.
So what do you make of that then?
I think his whole approach there was very, very cautious, very careful, which I think is probably the kind of watchword of the Virgin bid in total, to be honest, particularly with regard to the rolling stock that they're ordering. Also very interesting that he said, this is not just kind of the starting gun now for placing an order with Alstom. We need to actually get more from ORR to access the depot. So ultimately, I think that was very cautious in the way that he approached that. I think it's also comparatively interesting that he was hopeful about a positive working relationship with Eurostar. I think that was also comparatively interesting there as well. So there's definitely a lot of details that we're going to have to work through exactly how this access to the depot is going to work out.
One of the things I thought was fascinating about the whole conversation with Phil was saying, look, are you confident that you're going to be able to do a deal, or do you think there might be the need to go back to ORR? Because if you look at what Eurostar have said about this whole process, they're not shy at saying, well, hang on a minute, it's Section 17, it's only about light maintenance. It's, by the way, we don't have to really work with anybody if our existing operations are going to be disruptive. You kind of get the sense they're going to play it absolutely by the letter. And of course, Phil said, well, we hope we're going to have a collaborative relationship, but if we don't, that's what the ORR are there to do, to help us sort it out.
Exactly. And there's obviously a big question mark over the kind of future direction of Eurostar as well. That ties in from your previous episode about their fleet expansion or not, the integration of their continental European routes into their cross-channel routes or not. There's also this persistent rumor in French politics that maybe even the Eurostar CEO Gwendoline Cazeneuve might even be called back to Paris in an SNCF reshuffle. So ultimately, the question has got to be here is, Eurostar can be saying this now, but 6 months from now, what's that going to be looking like in particular? And over the last 18 months, there has been a complete big distinction between Eurostar's rhetoric about expansion and their actual behavior, which has not been organized towards expansion at all, because they could run more trains than they're currently doing through the Channel Tunnel. They could stop or look to stop in Ebbsfleet and Ashford if they wanted to, but they don't look like they want to. So there is this kind of double behavior here about trying to say, yeah, we're expanding, but in the short term, not actually doing it. Now, is there a legitimate case to say that actually by 2030, Temple Mills is actually going to be full? Should we really believe that or not? Right? And I'm not yet fully convinced. However many times Gwendoline Cazeneuve, the CEO of Eurostar, has said that they want to transport 30 million passengers by 2030, I'm not yet convinced that they're actually on the right path to being even able to do that. And indeed, we've got to go to like a little bit of that kind of those sort of tensions in the communication with regard to what was then submitted to ORR.
Could you go back to the Virgin solution on Eurostar, because it does have relevancy for the depot. I asked Phil, is this an off-the-shelf train, or are you going to have to adapt not only the train itself, but presumably the depot is going to have to take on board a new train. This is Temple Mills, that it hasn't had to deal with before. I was slightly surprised by his answer, which is basic. Well, the Eurostar looking at the horizon. It's obviously from the same family, so that's not going to be an issue. And no, basically it's off the shelf, but we will at least look to put 15 kV on so we can run to Germany, Switzerland. I was like, okay, I thought it was a bit more bespoke than that.
I think it's a good bit more bespoke than that. And ultimately, they might both be called Avelia, but they're entirely different trains in terms of the setup and indeed even the industrial history. The double-deck trains by Alstom are basically a French Alstom post-TGV design. And the Avelia Stream is a single-deck distributed traction, so the motor's under the floor, not with power cars, post-Pendolino Alstom Italy design. They are from completely different backgrounds. Now, let's just go through the changes Alstom has to make to the Avelia Stream to make it work for Virgin. They've got to up the speed from 250 to 300 kilometers per hour, which is going to need a new suspension system with air suspension rather than just coil springs, which the Avelia Stream has currently. Like there's a current version of it running in Poland, the ED250. And they're going to lengthen each carriage by 2 meters, so as to mean that there's going to be a 7-carriage, 200-meter long train, rather than the Polish and the Italian variants, which is 7-carriage, 186-meter long train. Oh, and maybe add 15 kilovolts in order to run in Germany and in Switzerland, right? Now, those are pretty major changes that need to be made to this platform. Now, it's not impossible. And also bear in mind that thing with regard to the depot, actually, the train, I would argue, is more similar to the Siemens trains run by Eurostar than it is common with those with motor cars. That is what Eurostar is ultimately going to order. So I wouldn't see that it would be insurmountable in the depot, but there's a big series of changes that need to be made to this Avelia Stream design. No one has yet actually ordered one with all of that combination that Virgin is ordering.
And not only that, of course, as Phil said, I've got to sort the depot out. the depot access agreement before I finalise the order. So Alstom won't know for sure they're going to be building these trains until the end of the year.
Right, but
time is
let's at
getting
least
tight.
look on the bright side, right? There is at least one other company which is negotiating with Alstom for similar trains. It's the company which was originally called Kevin Speed in France, now branding under the name Illisto. So a French private company that wants to order a 300 kilometers an hour stream variant. So it's not that Alstom is starting from zero. And also the order backlog in the works in Italy is comparatively shorter than the order backlog for Alstom works in France. So let's not make a mountain out of a molehill here. There are serious challenges here, but it is still doable for 2030, I would say.
Okay, because it also has to have the 30-minute operating window rather than the 15-minute one to be because of the tunnel as well. So that's another difference. But okay, no, that's very, very fair point. But one of the things you touched on briefly a moment ago was stopping at Ashford and Ebbsfleet. And that's obviously, perhaps if you were sat with a continental European perspective, maybe less of an issue. Here, of course, it's a massive issue and it's become a big political issue. I did have the opportunity to chat with Diccon Spain, who is the spokesperson and political liaison for the Bring Eurotrains Back to Ashford and Ebbsfleet campaign. And I asked him these very questions. This is what he had to say. Well, welcome to Green Signals, Diccon. Thanks so much for joining us. I suppose first question is, what was your reaction to the news last week about Virgin?
Well, my initial reaction was that it's a good result in terms of the monopoly's broken now, which is or will be when the services come in. So that's fantastic. And Virgin obviously put in a very good application, which has won through, and it was very, very impressive. In terms of our campaign, because obviously we're wanting to get services returned to Kent stations. Then there's a bit of a proviso, obviously, with the offer from Virgin, in that they're saying they will serve those stations if the stations are reopened. So there's a conditionality there with the Virgin application. That, for example, with the Gemini bid, there was a clear commitment to Ebbsfleet from day one. With the Trenitalia Italian State Railways one, there was a clear day one offer to serve Ashford. So there's a bit of conditionality to this. So there is a gap. But what's interesting about this is, so there's the gap from the Virgin side that they will serve those stations, but if the stations are reopened. But the matching bookend to that is the commitment from Peter Lord Hendy, who said on the same day that they are committed or championing the reopening of those stations. So there's a matching commitment from the other side. So it's a bit qualified, but that was my sort of reaction, really.
So happy, but you could maybe have been happier. Is that fair?
Yes? I think that's a fair summation, actually, Richard. Yeah. Okay. I certainly phoned Phil Whittingham up actually the same day and to congratulate him. But I did just dig in a little bit on the Kent station side just to check that I'd understood absolutely what it was, and that there is a commitment. But it is conditional on the reopening of the stations.
I mean, they were open, of course, up till March 2020, when sort of COVID hit, and it hit everybody. I mean, that was no transport operator was at fault clearly with that. But what's been the sort of the sense in Kent at the fact that those stations were just simply dropped from the timetable?
Well, the essence, I think, of the reaction is huge frustration and some level of anger, a lot of expression of real. Well, people have sort of flabbergasted, really, that they can't make logical sense of those stations being dropped, and it's done a lot of damage, I think, in terms of not just the economic side of it, because it's left an awful lot of companies stranded, in terms of not having that easy link. And interestingly, there's a whole cohort of French companies that came over to set up businesses in the UK, because the business regime or the environment is a lot simpler over here. They've all been left stranded, and there's a lot of Kent businesses that were doing business taking advantage of that easy journey. But there's all sorts of the impacts on people in general. There's a huge impact on people that would otherwise have travelled to see family. There's thousands of people that would have travelled to see family. There's a lot of people that have difficulties with getting through to St Pancras. So if you have a disability or you have a family with lots of luggage, there's a much bigger challenge getting through to that station than there was actually accessing, say, through Ashford.
But those issues at St Pancras that you've highlighted there could be fixed. I mean, they're not necessarily a reason to reopen another station. They are reasons to address those problems at St Pancras, presumably.
And that work is definitely taking place. I've had a number of conversations with Robert Sinclair at St Pancras, and there's clear ambition and activity to address a lot of those things. The reality at the moment is, and I was speaking to somebody yesterday, that it is an absolute scrum up there at the moment, and you've got the interaction between the domestic passenger side and the international on your approach to the station. Whereas, for example, at Ashford, you've got a complete separation, and the customer experience would be unparalleled because of that separation. So yes, they are working on it. It will get better, obviously. They're expanding the maximum sort of throughput from 1,800 passengers an hour to up to 2.5 or 2,500, and then with an ambition or with a target of getting up to 5,000 an hour.
Is it not the case, though, Diccon, that, I mean, Eurostar's a rational company. Okay, they're profitable. They're there to make money. If the market existed at Ebbsfleet and or Ashford, they may be different, I don't know. But if the market did exist and the costs of reopening, because obviously the border controls have changed significantly post-Brexit, they would do it. But the fact that those costs or the market don't justify it means they don't. I mean, surely it's a rational thing.
It's so the information really, I think, around this is and the rationality of this is that Eurostar are in a unique situation, that they're in a monopoly situation, as we all recognise. The dynamics within that monopoly situation mean that they are able to constrain demand to some extent within the offer. So they filled up all their trains. They can maintain a very high average price. And interestingly, I had exactly this conversation yesterday with somebody that uses it regularly. And they were really moaning about the high prices, and they can't access low prices. Some of the low ticket prices you get advertised are only available sort of on the earliest trains, which most people outside London can't get to. And there are a very limited number of those. And then the average prices, and it's all the prices sort of raise and lower depending on demand, are very high. Now, this suits Eurostar because they're making an awful lot of money. They've got a captive market and they can squeeze that market for as much as they possibly can. So in essence, this is a kind of long-winded way of me saying they're in a great situation. So they are in a monopoly and they can make the most of that monopoly. All the time that monopoly exists, the choice of actually opening up stations doesn't make sense within that monopoly situation. So that's the rational decision that they're making, which, you know, me or you would probably make the same decision in the same circumstances, probably. The other side of this is to tackle the demand from the Kent stations. And we know from all the data that we've got that there is huge latent demand, built up demand for that service in Kent. But the rational choice that Eurostar are making as a monopoly is that they choose to keep things logistically simple, of course, as well, single location in London, but also they can control prices and they can sort of balance up demand and prices. And in terms of your question about the cost of reopening the station, we think that's in a region of about 4 million, which might sound like a lot to you and me, but in the terms of spending on infrastructure, to gain reuse or actually bring that back into productive use. This is Ashford for 4 million.
Yeah.
The gain that you get from spending that 4 million, you've already invested 80 million in the station. There was about an 8 million signal upgrade as well. To get that 4 million in, you were then releasing huge benefits to the country. So Good Growth Foundation did a report recently which pointed up 2.7 billion pounds worth of additional incoming spend from the sort of tourism gain alone over 5 years. So your 4 million investment to actually get that back into action is repaid multiple times over very quickly, probably within months of a decent service being up and running. So that's small beer, really.
I can understand that from your perspective. I really do. But now let's just go back to what Eurostar and Virgin are saying, and actually what the ORR are saying, because the ORR said in their press release, but it's also obviously in their decision letter. They said many stakeholders wrote to ORR to welcome the prospect of competition on high-speed line on High-Speed 1. Many also wrote concerning the reopening of stations in Kent. And then this is the killer point, isn't it? ORR's decision today, however, strictly concerns access to Temple Mills. It does not, and ORR cannot require Virgin Trains to run specific services or stop them from changing what destinations they plan to serve.
Yeah.
So if Virgin is saying, we're not doing it unless somebody else pays for it, the person who would pay for it says, well, we haven't got the money, so we're not doing it. And the ORR says, well, we can't make anybody do anything. How on earth do you break that logjam? It feels as if no one can make this happen.
I think that's effectively so ORR's role is very narrow, and they have to be very, very careful over what they made their decision on. And I think you can see that very clearly from what they say within the statement you've just read out. But actually, it's interesting if you read I'm sure you have done. You read the letter from Eurostar to the ORR. They're dropping in a few times the word unlawful, and with the sort of intention to say, look, ORR, you stick to your lane. You make your judgment strictly on the things around the Temple Mills depot itself. Don't widen your remit outside your legally mandated responsibilities under Section 17, which is the bit of legislation that's primarily. Sure. So that was the reading I think we can get from the ORR's position. In terms of Virgin, they're making a very tightly constrained bid, which is obviously intended to successfully get the mandate or the permission to use the depot from the ORR, which obviously they succeeded in doing. So job done from the point of view of the way they've written their application. So they were very careful, and they've obviously got investors that are bought into this. So they're looking at really just setting the service up, and to be fair to them, getting the station back into action, although it's a very small amount of money overall, because as a provider, as an operator, we've looked at the figures. You can probably make in the region with a reasonable service level, say at Ashford, of about 100 million from ticket yields a year. So 4 million against 100 million yield is small change. But as the operator, you probably don't necessarily want to be dealing with that running the station side of it, nor do you probably want to be dealing with actually setting the station up. So I think that's not probably unexpected.
So I suppose final question: what happens next, right? Because even if you read the ORR decision letter, the fun starts now. Really, the hard work starts now. There's so much to do. Even if there's a fair wind, we're not talking about till 2030. Eurostar arguably aren't exactly incentivized to do anything with Ashford and Ebbsfleet straight away anyway. How are you going to keep the momentum going behind your campaign? Because the chances are nothing would actually happen until about 2030 anyway.
Well, the critical stuff behind that is, obviously things do need to happen between now and 2030, and so our focus does shift. So one of our main focus shifts is on to government to make sure that the government sets up a task group to actually reopen the stations or facilitate the reopening of the stations. So that's a number one priority, really, to get a task force going with the proper resources and the people involved that will get that delivered. So that's number one. Number two, actually, that we've not touched on, but is obviously the depot space decision from the ORR was looking at a small amount of the depot space that's available just at the Temple Mills. But we obviously know that there's action from government now to look at providing more depot facilities, either adjacent to that existing facility or elsewhere. And that's something I've been pushing government on for well over a year now, and I've had some conversations with senior civil servants on that exact matter. And actually, that was the first question I asked Peter Lord Hendy when he was at the Grow in Kent event that was at Ashford Station and then moved to Ebbsfleet. But that was the first question I asked about what's your sort of serious commitment to expanding depot capacity so that we can see as many competitors come in as possible, because we've still got the line only used at 50% capacity at the moment. Even bringing the Virgin offering a full stretch, they're looking at only about a quarter of the current volume of Eurostar. So they're sort of adding a quarter of the service to that. We're still going to have a lot of capacity. So it's critical.
So there you go. There's Diccon's view on the whole question of Ashford and Ebbsfleet. And that's sort of a bit of a longer piece, but I thought it was worth playing that so people could hear it. I mean, he seems to be making the point that when I asked him, surely it's just a rational decision. If it was if Eurostar are a profit maximizing company, right? If stopping at Ashford and Ebbsfleet made money, they would do so. They don't, so they don't, right? And he said, well, yeah, but it's because they're behaving in a monopolistic way. I mean, do you buy that argument?
I totally buy that argument. And it's very much in keeping with SNCF's behaviour with regard to all of its international operations, the Lyria operations to Switzerland, the price of international TGVs to Barcelona. The international routes of SNCF it's not good enough to be just profitable. You've got to be sky high profitable. And they want to have the simplest operations possible. They want to maintain the lowest amount of staff possible. And so ultimately that Ebbsfleet or Ashford were borderline profitable or even reasonably profitable is not enough. You've got to have sky high profitability. Now, the very interesting thing is it's kind of come back to bite Eurostar, because ultimately you could read between the lines of ORR going, well, we don't really believe in your expansion scenarios because, well, we don't believe that you're going to be able to be stopping at Ebbsfleet and Ashford, and you're not actually running more trains. So ultimately, actually, that behaviour that Diccon was talking about actually then became a disadvantage to basically win the political argument to say, actually, we don't really fully believe this expansion argument of Eurostar. That's why we're going to allocate Virgin some of the capacity. So ultimately, I'm very much on Diccon's side of that argument there, not on the argument made by Eurostar about Ashford and Ebbsfleet. Now, let's look also about what Virgin has said. Now, there is an opportunity here, because the single-deck trains that Virgin has ordered are exactly the right type of train for lots of interim stops. They board quickly, they've got distributed traction, so they accelerate quickly. You can stop at Ebbsfleet or at Ashford very easily and very quickly and lose far less time than with the double-deck new trains that Eurostar is going to be ordering. Far fewer doors, you've got to get your passengers up the stairs inside, it takes ages to board, you haven't got so many powered axles, so you don't accelerate as quickly. So actually, the rolling stock order that Virgin has made goes right into the strategy of basically Virgin cornering that market for stopping at Ebbsfleet and Ashford in the future and using that as a way of differentiating themselves from Eurostar.
What about cost, though? Because post-Brexit, we've now got more expense in terms of border controls. There's going to be a load of money that's going to be required to, I suppose, modify both stations to make them compliant with those current requirements. Then there's the cost of operating it all as well. I mean, these people aren't cheap or free. Do you think there's an argument that says, well, that's all fine, we'd love to stop there, but who's going to pay?
What I've always been missing in response to that is transparency on this point. Who would actually have to pay? You've got to staff the security checking points for the bag scans. You've got to have passport controllers. You might need to slightly adapt the terminals, perhaps more at Ebbsfleet than at Ashford, which has got an enormous building, which you can comparatively easily adapt. Ashford's the nicest Eurostar terminal by a country mile. It's like, it's better than anything else anywhere else, right? Like, rather than these rather kind of small, kind of tunnely type of arrangements you've got in Amsterdam or in Brussels. Brussels or the cramped arrangement in St Pancras. So I get what Virgin is saying about those costs there, but there is a political point here. Who has to pay for all of these different pieces? And if I were in Virgin shoes, I totally understand why they don't want to pay. And I also understand to some extent why Eurostar doesn't want to pay. But what I can't tell you is how much is that going to be? And is that going to kind of tip the balance over it to being unprofitable? Now, if you are the DfT or the Minister of Transport in the UK, you need to basically say, okay, well, hang on a minute. If we want to prioritize train journeys to continental Europe over flights, is there something that we can do there to balance that out, to make sure that all of the costs of the security personnel and the cost of extra passport controllers would actually be borne by the British state rather than being borne by Eurostar and Virgin Trains? So there is a legitimate question there, but in terms of the kind of overall hierarchy of how complicated these things are to fix, this shouldn't be a comparatively difficult one to solve.
And I think that's sort of Diccon's point, really. I mean, he was suggesting, potentially around about 4 million to upgrade the station to enable to do this, and probably something similar in terms of annual operating costs. And when you look at the hundreds and hundreds of millions that his campaigns say will flow from it, and you look at Lord Hendy, the rail minister's very public commitment for stopping at Ashford and Ebbsfleet, you kind of go, well, this is one area where maybe the state should pay, at which point Virgin will presumably go, not a problem, we'll stop there, day one.
And there's the additional point, St Pancras. So the question in social media, also in response to my previous appearance on Green Signals, was, hang on a minute, can you even run more trains out of St Pancras? Now, the answer is, yes, you can. And the current plans are to up the number of passengers per hour through there is from about 1,800 to about 2,700. So basically see that as going from 2 to 3 complete Eurostars an hour, basically, right? Now, the idea is in the medium term to up that to 5,000 passengers, but doing that is really hard. Now, while at the same time you want to retool St Pancras, can you actually transfer some of the demand to those people who may be able to board at Ebbsfleet or in Ashford instead, which actually might be a cheaper way of giving yourself that extra capacity than actually doing that major works you'd need to do at St Pancras to up the capacity to 5,000 passengers.
Which is Diccon's point, isn't it? Because at the moment, everybody that wants to has got to go into London just to come back out again. What happens if they don't have to do that? That and surely must help capacity at St Pancras.
And combining cars and trains, right? Like you and I as full-on railway people, that might not count particularly for us, but it's perfectly legitimate for people from outer London to drive around the M25, park at Ebbsfleet, or people from Kent and park at Ashford, and then take the train. I'd sooner they did that than driving all the way to a channel port, getting on the shuttle or the ferry, and then driving on the other side, right? That's still an environmental plus. That's still a plus for their comfort, right? And Ebbsfleet and Ashford not operating have cut off that kind of behaviour. And so, absolutely, there are plenty of ways to look at this. But again, we're back to are we looking at this in a narrow way, the depot, or should we look at this in a wider way about what type of people we're providing cross-channel services for?
Very fair point. And that takes us very neatly into something that may yet sort of still come into the mix. And that's Trenitalia, right? So one of the things when I was talking to Diccon, he said he'd spoken with Trenitalia, and there may be yet more to come from them. Here is what Diccon said.
No, this is all quite a way down the future. So all the time we've got to keep our eyes on the prize of getting the service expanded as soon as possible. And that's, at the moment, that's 2030 with Virgin coming in with their service. But also, actually, the other thing that I would say is the other person I had a conversation with on the day of the announcement was Ernesto Cecilia from the managing director of Trenitalia UK, who I've spoken to several times before. Obviously, to commiserate with him, it was sad that they didn't win that access to the depot. But obviously, I can't go into detail of exactly what he said to me, but what I can tell you, and what he did say that I could tell everybody, was that in 2 weeks' time they will be coming back with a response to what's happened. And my reading of all of this, and being very careful over what I say, is they are a very formidable, as we all know, they're a very formidable operator with huge experience. And obviously, I think to be fair to them, they were just edged by Virgin, I think, on the application. They are not going away. So we have the prospect, I think, a realistic prospect of them putting something very interesting to us in a couple of weeks' time. And obviously, my fingers crossed thing about this would be that they come in with a really good service, and they're not going to let this market go. They come in with a really good offer, and we get a second competitor. Now there's a lot of ifs and buts, and obviously we've still got the whole station thing to resolve. All of that is doable. I would not want to see something that's nationally important get bogged down for the sake of £4 million investment, which is peanuts. It's probably the price of putting in a new roundabout somewhere in the country. Because I think we do have a tendency in the country to get a bit sort of cynical, and we know the cost of everything, but we lose sight of the value of things. For the sake of that small amount of money, for goodness sake, let's get those stations open, let's get them served, and let's meet the huge demand that's out there.
And just on the Trenitalia thing, presumably they'd have to maintain the train somewhere else, because we do know that at Temple Mills, the ORR are very clear. There's capacity for one other operator or for Eurostar International Limited to have its growth plans, but that's it. So
yeah,
if Trenitalia did something, it would have to be from a base elsewhere, right?
Absolutely right. Yes, that's an absolutely given. So obviously the Temple Mills ship has sailed, and that's been allocated to Virgin. So absolutely right. Okay. They would have to maintain their fleet elsewhere, both the heavy maintenance and the light maintenance stuff. But again, without going into details, that is doable. That is doable, and they're the company really to do it, because they've got the experience. They've obviously got the rolling stock. They've got the facilities that they are using in various places.
They've got the cash.
They've got cash, absolutely. So we will see them coming back, which is really good news, I think, from the point of view of rail users in this country. And I'm really pleased. I'm really pleased that Virgin have got that access, which allows them to innovate and make their offer as well. Which I'm really interested to see what they do. And obviously let's keep our fingers crossed that something really good comes in from Trenitalia, and I would think that something really interesting will come in, and we will see certainly a position from them in 2 weeks. That's something that I have been allowed to share with everybody. So,
well, I'm very pleased, because that means we've got the basis of another conversation probably in 2 or 3 weeks' time. Well, fingers crossed. Let's see what happens. It could be a very interesting few weeks and months ahead. But for now, thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on, Rich, and been very enjoyable. Thank you. See you soon.
So what do you make of that? I mean,
that's really interesting. And very specific. Also, within 2 weeks, we're going to find something out. Now, let's try and look at the crystal.
I can't tell you what, but I can tell you that I'm allowed to tell you this.
Right? Right, exactly. Well, let's look into the crystal ball and try and work out what it might be then, right? Now, so the Trenitalia is stepping up its operations in France quite significantly. It's going to be running more trains from Paris to Lyon to Marseille from the December timetable change. And it's reaching the limits of what it can do by sending its trains back to Italy for the heavy maintenance. Ultimately, it's reaching the stage where it needs a maintenance workshop in France. Is what we're going to hear then in 2 weeks from now, Trenitalia announcing it's going to make a maintenance workshop somewhere in France, logically bearing in mind most of their routes are towards the south, and then there would be potentially this one to London. It would have to be somewhere in Greater Paris, and you could find places in eastern Paris, probably on the cut round line that goes from Charles de Gaulle to Marne-la-Vallée, somewhere off there, to build a depot. And could that be then the solution, that basically Trenitalia could run London operations without needing Temple Mills because it could do all of the maintenance in France? That would be a plausible way and means which would be consistent with their French expansion and consistent with what Diccon has said there.
I mean, that could be extraordinary, couldn't it? Because then we could potentially be seeing Eurostar with some growth in capacity because they're bringing double-decker Horizon train sets. So even if they don't do any more paths, there's more capacity there. And Virgin and Trenitalia and Ebbsfleet and Ashford back open again. I mean, this could, it could be about to be Christmas all at once.
Right, but also look at it this way. Trenitalia's game here is an entirely different one than Virgin's, right? Virgin is basically saying, we are a UK railway company with a UK tradition. They don't put it in those terms, right? But it's essentially that. We see a problem from London to continental Europe, and that's the problem that we want to solve. Trenitalia sees that entirely the other way around. We've got an extremely successful model in Italy. We've identified business opportunities from Italy to France first, then in Spain, and then in France alone. Where else are there business opportunities here? And with their Hitachi trains, they're as close as you've got to a kind of go-anywhere train, right? Yeah. So ultimately, unlike Virgin, which is very much focused on it's basically the Channel Tunnel or nothing for their expansion. I can't imagine Virgin Trains is going to tomorrow start running Amsterdam to Berlin or something, right? Whereas Trenitalia is
not like with 12 streams.
Trains, no, right? Okay, but anywhere in continental Europe, right? Imagine, I don't know, we have this conversation 12 months from now, and Virgin's negotiations over Temple Mills have come to nothing, and Alstom discovered a problem with their rolling stock. Could Virgin feasibly say we're going to uproot and move to a continental European route? Probably not, because of the nature of the company. Trenitalia, by contrast, can go, right, well, we've got the whole of the European market basically to play with. Where is it most sensible for us to invest? And indeed, France is absolutely the most important for them to invest. They still see an opportunity for London, but if that door were to close, it wouldn't surprise me, for example, that they'd rival Eurostar on the continental European Eurostar routes, running instead to Brussels and Amsterdam from Paris rather than running to London. So the Channel Tunnel, there's always been this thing in the back of my head that for Trenitalia, the Channel Tunnel is an interesting opportunity, but it's not the be-all and end-all to the same extent it would be for Virgin or for Gemini.
But yet, Diccon certainly feels that we're about to hear something which suggests it's become a very important part of the strategy. So it is going to be a very interesting few weeks.
Together with the wider strategy, right?
Okay.
I would say...
You don't believe they're capable of being disconnected. They have to be seen as one whole strategy. I think
they've got to be... well, how else can they do it, right? You've got to have a depot somewhere, right? Yeah. Any other depots you could potentially foreseeably think of in the UK, well, you basically could find a brownfield site at Barking near the Ford plant. At Ashford, you could maybe retool the Hitachi existing works where they maintain the Javelin trains, but actually at the moment, you can't actually get with a European loading gauge train. You can't even get in there. There is a bit of brownfield land on the other side at Ashford, but we're not even there to even think about that. Or you could go as far as Dollond's Moor, so at the entrance to the Channel Tunnel. But then you've got a massive maneuver of an empty train to get to those places where you could maintain the trains. The obvious choice for Trenitalia is to reverse it entirely and do all of your maintenance in France, probably. Now, if they wanted to ever then run to Brussels, there is a little bit of capacity at the Forêt depot just south of Brussels Midi, and the Belgian State Railways SNCB that has the unique ownership of that depot from next year would be willing to talk to you for doing some maintenance there. So, but ultimately, France is the big question. We know that Le Landy, the depot north of Paris Gare du Nord, is full, and you'd need some other alternative place to maintain Trenitalia trains. So, and I can't see how the UK, a new UK depot, they're going to suddenly pull that rabbit out of the hat, which logically means it's got to be tied up with what they're doing in France, because I can't see any other way that it could work.
Certainly not in a short timescale, I agree.
Yeah.
Although, of course, the Department for Transport the UK Department for Transport have now said, we are going to seek partners. There's a kind of a tender notification now. It's like the phase before, isn't it?
Yeah.
Saying we're looking at the potential for a new depot. I mean, what do you think? Good intervention by the Department for Transport?
I think it's important. Ultimately, what we've learned from all of this about Temple Mills is an important piece of the jigsaw, but it's not sufficient. So ultimately, trying to solve that is correct, but it's going to be a very complicated task to find the right place with the right access, not too far from London, how expensive it would be in order to manage to build such a facility. Bear in mind, there is also, the UK as an island problem here, because ultimately the way and means of doing this economically is an economy of scale. So you maintain a larger fleet. You could maintain a fleet for a number of different operators because, of course, there's lots of different private companies which want to enter into different parts of the European railway market. So if you took the example of how you maintain freight locomotives, where you ultimately have workshops which are dedicated to maintaining locomotives for dozens of different companies in Europe, you'd ultimately need a high-speed train maintenance workshop that could maintain for, ideally, for either all of Trenitalia's fleet or for half a dozen private operators, each of which had a small fleet but were not powerful enough individually to build their own workshops. So you've got to have some scale in this, and the difficulty is for any UK workshop, what scale have you got? Because also you can't even get your HS2 trains to a workshop on HS1 unless you routed them around the North London line, which poses its own headaches, right? So the DFT is asking the right question, but it strikes me the hurdles to get there are really, really big.
But they're probably the only people that can do this.
Yeah,
I mean, a private company, a Virgin, arguably even an individual state railway is going to go, well, we just can't really justify that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's got to be a government-led thing. Okay, so we think good intervention.
But look at it this way. I keep on getting this question in anything that I write about the future of the Channel Tunnel is, why are these companies not investigating more maintenance in continental Europe and less in the UK? Now, the answer to that is a kind of an availability heuristic. We knew the game in Temple Mills. We've been focusing on that game for the last 12 months. The nature of what is available in northern France, in Belgium, in anywhere in the area of Paris, we don't really know that to the same extent. Now, I even started to wonder, should I actually, in my way of doing grassroots research, go and check all of those places on the ground in the same way I've been checking stations that you could run to in continental Europe to try to better answer that question. But there's a bit of a blind spot in this debate. Everyone's been focusing on the UK end and focusing less on the continental European side of the conundrum.
Which perhaps where we should have done. Okay, it's interesting. Go on then, let's summarize this whole thing. You know, we've had this amazing announcement. It was dramatic. We had the usual Virgin PR pizzazz, slightly
which is well done. You've got to give them their due.
Oh, I listen, it's absolutely superb. You know, existing operators may experience some discomfort. I mean, the banners at the station, it was as you would expect them to do, and it was really well done. But what have we really learned? I mean, I know what we've learned, but so much for me seems yet to be unknown, right? There's still so much detail to go. I feel as if we've got to the end of the beginning, but that's all, right? I mean, is that fair, do you think?
I think that's fair.
Your takeaway?
But I think we know now that there is a commitment also from ORR to open up Temple Mills and to take those next steps against Eurostar, probably if it's necessary, right? And that will give Virgin's investors enough security to think that they're going to be okay, that this is going to be a safer bet than they thought. We have a bit more clarity about who is going to do that and how Virgin is going to be able to advance. So I think we're a considerable step forward this week. And importantly, if it had gone the other way, right, that no entrant had been in place in Temple Mills, we would have been basically a step back. So maybe the fact that we've not made that step back is actually perhaps the most significant point. We've got a lot to do, right? We'll see what we get from Trenitalia. Gemini have said that they want to potentially carry on, although exactly how that's going to work, we don't really know yet. We should find out something that, as Phil Whittingham said earlier on here, they want to make that order for the new trains by the end of this year. So we can see what the next few dominoes to fall will be. And I think that's important. And I think that that's significant. And I think ultimately, let's put it this way, we are closer to there being competition in the Channel Tunnel than we've ever been. All right. And that is not to be underestimated. We've got a process now. When we had that thing 10 or 15 years ago, when Deutsche Bahn ran an exploratory train through the Channel Tunnel, we didn't even know how all of these other pieces of the jigsaw would even fall together, right? We didn't even get that far. Now we've actually got that far, at least. We can at least see what the next pieces look like. And so I think in that regard, there is a certain degree of optimism there. Now, it's also important that, again, in the reactions to what I've been writing about this topic, a lot of people said, well, we don't really trust Virgin, we don't really trust competition. Is this actually a good thing? Now, I think we need to answer that question the other way around. What's the alternative? We have no way of applying political pressure to Eurostar, really, since the UK sold its stake in Eurostar in 2015. Eurostar is behaving like a privately owned monopolist, basically, already. It is 75% owned by the state railways, but it's still behaving in a way which is market rational for a private monopolist. What other option have you got? You want to open it up to competition, and you've gone for the most solid, predictable bet to make competition work. Right? I think that's probably the best way of looking at it. So ultimately, you can say we're not potentially very euphoric about this, right? We're not. This looks like Virgin looks like a private copy of Eurostar, yeah, with slightly smaller versions and red and white trains instead of blue ones. But ultimately, the alternative is considerably worse, which is essentially Eurostar's persistent monopoly behavior and not serving its customers and not serving them well. So ultimately, I think we've got to see all of this as a small step forward this week. Although I agree with you, of course, the hurdles to overcome still are quite considerable.
There's still a lot. But the only slight challenge I would have on that is I do think having any competitor there, and Virgin will approach this in a very Virgin way, will impact on the pricing model. Because at the moment, even if it's not quite what, maybe everybody would have wanted, simply Eurostar having somebody there is going to say, I'm sorry, we're not charging that, we're charging this, is going to impact the market only in a positive way.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Do you think we're any closer to seeing trains stop at Ebbsfleet and Ashford as a result of this announcement?
Neutral. Difficult to say.
Yeah, well,
it's not a no from Virgin, which is helpful. Wouldn't surprise me if Eurostar would now say, okay, actually, we see an opportunity. Let's get into that discussion before Virgin gets there. Wouldn't surprise me at all if they were to behave that way. And I think actually having Peter Hendy backing it and potentially getting a bit more transparency. So if I were in Diccon Spain's shoes, I understand why he's not as optimistic than if Trenitalia had got the okay for Temple Mills, but there's still opportunities for Ebbsfleet and for Ashford in here. So I would say I'm kind of neutral. I'm not negative, definitely, about that.
Fair enough. Well, listen, John, that, as ever, fascinating, thoroughly enjoyable, good knockabout stuff. And it looks like, even better, in 2 or 3, 4 weeks, we might have something else to chat about that could sort of throw it all up in the air again. So what's not to like?
Right. So I've got one more. I've got one more for you as well, actually, Richard.
Go on.
So I am in my independent research work about the future of the Channel Tunnel on 17th of November. I'm releasing my report about destinations for Channel Tunnel trains. So I've been doing this research all of this year, and the report's coming out now in a couple of weeks to basically say if you wanted to run from London to other places in continental Europe beyond Brussels and beyond Paris, where could you go? And so I've been researching all of these routes, all of these stations, all of the capacity, what you need to build terminals in all of those places. So that, at least, I will then in my work, so coming out in a fortnight, be able to answer that question. If you want to get beyond Brussels and Paris, where could you go? So that at least is another conundrum or another piece of the jigsaw, which I'm trying to answer kind of on my own back. But I'll have some answers for you on that point in just a week or two.
What an excellent pitch. Well, on that basis, can I invite you back on when that's published? And we can have a chat about that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because I'm only sort of predicting the questions that are going to flow back from listeners to this, right? Get him on to talk about that. John, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. One thing's for sure, this never gets dull, does it? And I'm sure it's not going to do for a long time yet. But for now, Jon Worth, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed that discussion. If you did, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, like the video, and why not subscribe to the channel? It really helps us do more of this kind of content. And please keep watching for more Green Signals videos on this and many other subjects of interest on the railways. But for now, thank you.